Hello everyone and welcome to Gurukul Online Learning Network. Today we are covering the topic of WSDC, World School Debating Championships. And as mentioned before, WSDC has a lot of speakers and each speaker has a different role to fulfill. And from there we are going to talk about Prime Minister or PM. Now, Prime Minister is the first speaker of each debate. So the Prime Minister is one of the most, if not the most important speaker in the whole of debate. The Prime Minister, as the first speaker, has a lot of responsibilities to fulfill and a strict structure to maintain. Remember, in WSDC, the structure is a very big key in achieving a good score. So make sure you follow a structure, make sure your debate is structured to the core, and make sure you are doing your responsibilities properly and manage them to the best of your abilities. So without further ado, let's get into the nitty-gritty stuff of Prime Minister. First of all, the first responsibility that a Prime Minister has is characterization. Now, what does characterization mean? Characterization is to characterize the debate. Debates have a lot of notions to it. Debates have a lot of different topics, and those topics need to be discussed before going through with the debate. So, characterization is not necessarily defining the terms. It is quite a common practice in AP to take on characterization as defining the terms of the debate. No, you need to set a proper characterization and the context of the debate. So, for example, if I say this house will make sure all the freedom fighters and their daughters and sons get free education. Now, in this debate, you can characterize the freedom fighters as the freedom fighters of Bangladesh or different freedom fighters in different freedom wars. So in this context, you could either talk about Bangladesh or a completely different war that has happened or has occurred in this world. And as such, you are setting up the premise of the debate and the motion and how the debate will play out. We will have a much more in-depth session on characterization, but for now, know that this is the general idea. During the characterization, one of the things that the Prime Minister should remember: do not strawman or squirrel the debate. What do we mean by this? We mean that you cannot come in and say that in Bangladesh, the freedom fighters that were in this specific date will be given the privilege. So you need to remember, you cannot talk about one specific event. You need to talk about the whole debate in general. So remember, characterization is not defining and making it so concise that your opposition has no way to talk about any different other ideas. So make sure you come in and give a general overview of the debate and what you want to talk about. Do not strawman, do not squirrel. So after characterization, what is the next thing the Prime Minister has to do? They need to identify the stakeholders. What are the stakeholders? The stakeholders are different people who are going to be recognized in the debate. So what do I mean by this? By this, I mean that this one topic that I talked about, freedom fighters, they are the stakeholders of the debate. So these are the people that we are going to talk about, not about some general people who are businessmen or stuff like that. Of course, there can be a businessman who is a son or daughter of the freedom fighters, but they are not the direct stakeholders of the debate. The stakeholders should be precise and should be someone we talk about and is directly affected by the debate. So make sure after you characterize the debate, you come in and say that these are the stakeholders who are going to be directly affected by the debate. We are going to specifically talk about them. Third of all, they need to set a burden. What do I mean by a burden? Now, burden is something that your team and the opposition team has to prove. What do I mean by this? If we are going to talk about the freedom fighters of Bangladesh, then what is the burden on us? If we are the proposition or the government, we need to come in and talk about why these freedom fighters require a waive of their college tuitions or school tuitions. We need to come in and prove with our set criteria that these are the specific reasons why we need to come in and prove that when these criteria or burdens are fulfilled, we are going to win this debate. So make sure you come in, characterize the debate, give the stakeholders, and identify the burden your team has and your opposition team has. You can set a burden for the opposition team as well. If they choose to accept it, that's good. But if they don't choose to accept it, I will talk about it later. Then you need to give a general overview of the debate. What do I mean by this? I have talked about characterization. I've talked about stakeholders. Aren't these the general overview of the debate already? No, these aren't. You need to come in and tell the adjudicator what you want to prove and how you're going to prove it. After you've characterized the debate, after you've set the burden, after you've given the stakeholders, you need to come in and say that these burdens that we have set on ourselves, we are going to prove this through this arguments. The arguments can be made up by you. The arguments are the essential to the debate to prove the debate as a whole. So now, after you've given the general overview of the debate, there is another important thing that you need to take into consideration. That is, allocate the duties to the speaker. What is this? Well, the Prime Minister, as the first speaker of their team, has this huge burden to set what their other speakers are going to talk about. Once as the Prime Minister, you've come in, you've given your characterization, you've given your burden, you've identified your stakeholders, you've given how the debate will play out. So when you're talking about how the debate will play out, you need to tell us how that debate is going to be argumented. So from there, you need to give us an idea of what arguments you are going to talk about, what arguments your deputy is going to talk about, and the whip will come in and give the rebuttals to the opposition side. So you need to come in and give us a general idea of the arguments that you're going to speak about and the arguments that your deputy is going to speak about. So for example, if we have 3 arguments to talk about, you can choose to provide 1 argument by yourself, and then you can choose to allocate those 2 arguments to your deputy. So after this, you need to take into consideration, you need to have a very good harmony between your speakers, and you need to make sure your team is on one page. So make sure your arguments are fleshed out completely. Make sure your arguments are fixed beforehand. Do not come in and give a new argument that you haven't even talked about. That actually cuts your marks and may look bad to different adjudicators. So make sure this has been allocated and make sure you have talked about this as a whole. Then, as mentioned, you can come in and provide arguments. Now, what are arguments and how to approach them? We will have a much more in-depth session about arguments and rebuttals in general. But as you're the Prime Minister, you do not have to rebut anything. So you don't have any arguments from your opposition. As you're the first speaker, you have the complete stage and you can come in and provide your arguments freely. So make sure after you've done all the duties that you have, you need to come in and provide your arguments that are completely unknown to the opposition. This provides the biggest advantage, as if you give a good argument, the opposition will have no way to reply to that or rebut to it. And if your argument is good enough, this will create a huge impression for your following speakers, as the adjudicator will be impressed and will like to hear much more about your following arguments. And as such, do make sure your arguments are precise, concise, and are to the core and are good. 7th, and the final of all, you need to summarize your whole speech. So after you've done everything, you need to summarize your whole speech. So how do we summarize this? You can take the key points, you can tell the arguments that you've talked about, and make sure your arguments are important to the debate. So you need to come in and prove that your arguments are important to the debate also. You cannot just come in and say this argument and then say that, okay, this argument is done. You need to come in and link it back to the argument. So from this, what do we get? The overview. First of all, you need to come in and characterize the debate, characterize what the stakeholders are. You need to come in and characterize what the debate is going to talk about. Characterization is very important. Then the stakeholders, you can characterize the stakeholders who are going to be affected by this motion and who are the primary players in this motion. Then you need to set a burden on yourself and your opposition team. What you need to prove to win this debate and what the opposition needs to prove to win this debate. And after that, you need to give a general overview of the debate, like how this debate is going to play out. How is this debate going to be important to this scenario? How is this debate so important that we are talking about this? Then, as you're giving the general overview of the debate, you need to allocate the duties to your speakers. So make sure you're allocating that I will talk about, we have 3 arguments, this. I will talk about the first argument. My deputy will come in and talk about the following 2 arguments. All right. And then you need to come in and provide your own arguments. Do make sure that you're not spending so much time on characterization, identifying stakeholders, burdens, that you do not have any time to talk about your own argument. This is a huge problem since your deputy has to then cover for you. Your deputy has to come in and talk about your arguments, whereas they had to talk about 2 arguments. They would have a much better time explaining it. If you do not provide your arguments, they will have to now provide 3 arguments, which is a very difficult burden to do in 3 minutes. So make sure you have enough time allocated to provide your arguments. General rule of thumb is to talk about all these characterizations, stakeholders, and burden for the first 5 minutes of the debate, and then for the last 3 minutes of the debate, you can talk about your arguments and make sure to flesh them out as best as you can, and make sure you're linking it back to the motion as to why this is important and how we need to do this. And then make sure you are summarizing your whole debate. Summarize the debate with key points and what you have talked about, so the adjudicator has a much better understanding of what you're trying to prove. The summary is very important as it links your debate back to the motion, and then it links your own arguments back to the motion and proves why it is so important that we need to look into this, and why it is so important that we need to make sure these arguments are taken into account. Now, what we have learned so far, we have learned about the roles and structure of a prime minister. Make sure you follow the structure, because in WSDC, structure is a very important thing. You need to make sure your structure is precise. You need to make sure you're following the right structure, from characterization to stakeholder to burden to identity to giving your own overview of the debate, to allocating your arguments to your deputies and your whips, and make sure you are summarizing the debate. As I have mentioned before, summarizing is very, very important, and make sure you are following it to the core. Thank you, everyone. If you like this video, do make sure to share, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comment box.